What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown, a crime history podcast. As always, we are presented by Barstool Sports, and I am your host, Jeff Nadu. We are back today with another very interesting crime topic. I want to say hello to everybody out there. I hope you're having a great week. It's that time of the week where we delve into another part of the criminal universe, and I always look forward to recording these shows. It's a time away from the regular life, my sports, all the different things I have going on. And since April of 2021, we've done this, and I look forward to it every week. As always, if you're watching us on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button and make sure you hit the like button to the video so you never miss another video, and these videos continue. We appreciate all the continued support on YouTube. Also, if you're watching or checking us out anywhere else or listening to us on our podcast, on iTunes, Spotify, Google Pods, wherever you listen, make sure you leave us a detailed review and let us know what you think of the show by giving us 5 stars. We greatly appreciate it. If you want more great crime content, updates on the show and other things, make sure you follow us on Twitter at Sitdown Crime Pod. We really appreciate it. The continued involvement of the listener is what makes this show so great, and we grow every week. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get in to another facet of criminal history. And we talk about the mafia. We talk about drug dealers, cartel bosses, serial killers, extortion artists, everyone and anyone. Now, today's subject is not a mobster, though he believed he was. I would speak to someone on today's subject, and he would tell me that this individual believed he was a mobster. He was a wannabe gangster, a wannabe wise guy. He truly felt his life was a movie and that the things that he did were warranted because they had, quote, spurned him. We're going to talk about the disturbing and depraved Cosmo DiNardo, a man who, to me, is a combination of many things. Someone who was absolutely someone who fell through the hands of the mental health community, someone who should have never been on the street, and someone whose life was really shaped due to the fact that he never had to answer for anything he did. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and instead of doing what was right, he felt like the things that he had learned through movies and television and on the internet were more important than anything that he had actually learned in his real life. He believed he was a cartel boss. He believed he was a high-level drug trafficker, and it would ultimately lead to the death of 4 individuals that we would eventually call the Lost Boys of Bucks County. Let's get into the very sinister and depraved life of Cosmo DiNardo. Cosmo DiNardo was born January 21st, 1997. He'd be born in the suburbs of Bensalem, just outside of Philadelphia. His parents, Antonio and Sandra, were actually pretty normal people. In fact, they were quite wealthy. DiNardo was born, as I said earlier, with a silver spoon, if you will. He was given every advantage to succeed in life. His parents actually came up with a company called Metro Ready Mix and Supply. And what it was basically was a concrete construction company. They would do various construction projects, including subdivisions and building homes, everything from footings to walls to stucco to anything that involves concrete, pouring concrete, whatever. And it was a very successful business. In fact, Sandra DiNardo, Mr. DiNardo's mother, actually would create a parent company called Bella Concrete and Trucking. And this is a company that would essentially handle the delivery and things of that nature to the different job sites. So they had a very burgeoning business. And, one thing I learned about the life of Cosmo DiNardo, the one person I truly, truly feel bad for outside of the families of the people that were viciously killed by DiNardo was his mother. And if you know anything about Sandra DiNardo, she had tried everything with her son. And as I said before, a mother's love is the most sacred in someone's life. And Mr. DiNardo's mother surely tried. Until the end, you'd have to feel bad for the person that she believed she had created. She did everything she could for her son. Now, DiNardo, as I said, on the surface, had everything he could ask for. He was a part of what would be called a, quote, all-American family. He had brothers and sisters. He had a pool. He had a home in rural Bucks County where he could go ride quads and dirt bikes. He was taught how to use heavy machinery and equipment. Really, every kid, when you grow up, you see these kids, they love going to job sites and seeing bulldozers. And DiNardo was given all of that. His father was very hardworking and did everything he could to provide his kids with maybe something that he didn't have. His father also allegedly had a very large real estate portfolio that he had gained from his father, Cosmo. And if you know anything about the Italian community, generally sons of kids are named after their grandfather. So he would take his father's grandfather's name. Now, they would have homes in Philadelphia, rental properties and businesses and all sorts of that. So on the surface, DiNardo had everything he wanted. By fourth grade, a classmate would say something very interesting about DiNardo as well. A woman called Sandra, she wouldn't want to be identified. She would say that she attended elementary school with Mr. DiNardo in Bensalem. And at the time, she would remember him as, quote, a normal kid who just got into minor trouble. She said he was actually once given something called the Peacemaker of the Month Award, which I would assume was given to a kid that exemplified good behavior and probably treated people with respect and was always welcoming to other classmates. So again, on the surface, a very normal kid, a very normal boy. He wasn't out killing animals and beating people up and things like that. DiNardo was pretty normal. Now, by eighth grade, though, we would start to see kind of a different side of Mr. DiNardo, but that wouldn't continue the stream of good comments about him. A person called Chris Helmuth, who would know Mr. DiNardo since, quote, fourth grade, would say that the Cosmo that he knew for 10 years would never be capable of what he ultimately did. So we start to see that early in DiNardo's life, he's a normal kid, but by eighth grade, he starts doing what most normal kids do, lifting weights, playing football. And this is where kind of, I think, DiNardo's life truly changed. I don't know if it'll ever be actually looked at, but this is where his life truly changed to me. DiNardo played football in eighth grade, was part of junior high teams and things like that. He would ultimately have to quit due to concussions. And we would learn over the last 10 or so years that football is a very destructive thing for some people. If they get hit too many times in the head, they begin to be different people. And this is where a lot of sinister, odd, weird behavior starts with DiNardo. And we're going to get into some of the really weird things he began to do. According to a woman called Amber Peters, she would say that Mr. DiNardo began acting very volatilely to other people. According to her, at one point, she would say, quote, Cosmo was crazy. He had been talking about killing people since he was 14. And at one point, someone else would mention that he had punched two strangers at a mall when he saw them talking to his girlfriend. So we begin to see that maybe he's a little volatile. He jumps off the handle very quickly, has a short temper. But a lot of this stuff is pretty, outside of talking about killing people, that's pretty odd. But, just knocking someone out as a kid because they talk to your girlfriend, I guess that's not incredibly weird. But it was weird coming from him because, like I said, he'd never really acted like this before. DiNardo's sinister behavior would continue. According to the same woman, Amber Peters, she would also say that he would make unwanted, obnoxious overtures to young women on social media. And we would learn that, oddly enough, he almost seemed like a bit of an incel. She would say that he would randomly message girls saying, quote, hey, babe, calling them hoes and trying to have sex with them. And this is a number of different messages that he would report to other people. He would ultimately graduate in 2015 from Holy Ghost Prep School in Bensalem. Now, this is a Catholic school where he would get his high school diploma. Upon his graduation in September of 2015, he would enroll at a university in the Bensalem, Philadelphia area called Arcadia. And he would still live with his parents during all this. Now, the thing about DiNardo is his behavior would get more and more odd, and the weird and unwanted messages from DiNardo would continue. According to a woman called Sarah Diner, who was a student of Arcadia, who eventually went to classes with DiNardo, she would say that at one point during the semester, he would invite several female students to his house to swim. And Mrs. Diner would say she declined, but DiNardo would not leave it at that. He would eventually say, that he wanted to hang out on occasion and constantly every day asking her different things. She would say that she blocked his number because he didn't get his way. He would get so upset. I think he had anger management issues, honestly. Now, DiNardo would ultimately only complete one semester at Arcadia, but he didn't stop coming to Arcadia. So he wasn't going to school there, but he would continue hanging out at campus, start acting odd, doing stupid things, having a lot of verbal arguments. And eventually the university would threaten to send a letter to Mr. DiNardo. A woman at the university called Laura Baldwin would say that he unnerved university community members, and the school would eventually send him a letter stating that if he returned to campus, he would be treated as a trespasser. Now, the school would also locate and contact the local police in his area. So this is, again, very odd behavior by DiNardo, but nothing to the level of being arrested. But I think the police in Bensalem knew who Mr. DiNardo was. Now, Mr. DiNardo would say down the road that during this time, he allegedly would commit 2 homicides in Philadelphia. Nothing has ever been substantiated. But what we start learning is Mr. DiNardo is probably watching a lot of films, pretending that he's in a drug cartel. At one point, it was discussed that he had begun searching online about drug cartels and he wanted to be like them. And, he would also have to face the fact that he was out of school. He had no job. What was he going to do now? So what does he do? He goes back and starts working for dad, right, at the concrete company. Didn't last long, though. He would tell friends that he was selling, quote, firewood. Now, to DiNardo, we would find out that meant he began to sell narcotics. Now, he would start on a very small level, but DiNardo believed that ultimately he was going to become Tony Montana, and we'll get to that in just a second. But the insular thing that would happen in DiNardo's life that I believe truly probably shaped what he became. I want to make this clear. I'm not ever going to make excuses for someone like this. That said, we look at the possible multiple concussions he had. We then fast forward to May of 2016. As I said earlier, by this point, the family had a 90-acre rural farm/home that they had in Upper Solbury Township outside of Philadelphia, not far away from their Bensalem home. Think of it like a retreat, right? You go there on the weekends, a lot of land. It's not suburbia where there's yards every couple of feet. There's big fields, and they would use the location for the company to store equipment and other things like that, and also had a big home on the premises. And this is something that we would learn that rich people buy, right? To store things, good storage. They have land. DiNardo was always at this place. And in May of 2016, he would be involved in an ATV accident. I want to relate this to my own life because when I was a kid, I had an ATV. We had jet skis as well. And I remember when we would be at the shore or whatever, my father would always tell us, don't ever ride alone, right? When we're kids. Because if something happens, what, who would know? This would relate to Mr. DiNardo. He would go ATVing alone. And according to him, he would get in an accident. He would break multiple bones where he was unable to walk, including a broken ankle. He would also, according to him, hit his head. And he doesn't remember much outside of that. But he would essentially, for hours, scream for help and no one would know until his father would find him hours later. And it would be a long recovery process for DiNardo. But one thing that was evident from this point on, Mr. DiNardo went from being volatile and odd to sinister and depraved. And a lot of people point back to this manic episode that he had. And according to his old friend, Chris Helmuth, he was never the same after this. The kid that he had known 10 years before or so was long gone. And this is where his mother, you truly feel bad for her because she realized something was wrong with her son. Sandra DiNardo would ultimately begin taking DiNardo to see a psychiatrist at the University of Pennsylvania. And that shrink would ultimately diagnose him with, quote, bipolar and schizophrenia tendencies. And he'd be placed on medication. Now, the good thing that we have with medication is generally it fixes the problem. But we would delve into DiNardo, a very kind of up and down method of taking the medication. When he took the medication, he was very normal. But according to his mother, when he didn't take the medication, he was a psychopath. Now, I want to talk about DiNardo's father just a little bit, because while I said he was a hard worker, one thing we can learn about hard workers is eventually they have to work, so they're not always around. And what I think DiNardo's father, he was probably a suspect in, was he never actually, I think, fathered his kids. He would give them things and treat them materialistic, but I don't know if he ever like loved them or try to like teach them right from wrong. And we would learn from Cosmo DiNardo that his father would teach him how to drive trucks and construction equipment, but also how to shoot guns as well. And it was very known throughout the family that not only did Sandra and Tony DiNardo have license to carry plus firearms, but so did DiNardo, and he was licensed to carry a 357. Now, Tony said that he would deal with his son's rage at one point, and according to the psychiatrist, Cosmo would tell him that he had once wanted to, quote, shoot his dad with an AK-47. Now, that would come from the fact that we would learn that Tony DiNardo, Cosmo's father, was unfaithful to his wife. And at one point, he would actually, Cosmo, see his father with his gumata, and it sent him into a rage. And this is where he begins threatening to kill people, even his father. At one point, he said multiple times he wanted to kill his father. Now, for Cosmo DiNardo, he continued the weird behavior with women. He began sending all sorts of messages to different people on Facebook and things like that. And those can be recovered. If you ever want to look them up, you can find them. Very weird behavior. And this is also when he's taking antidepressants, he starts kind of having some side effects. He goes from being a in shape youth to overweight, lost some confidence probably, and he begins acting like a lunatic online. That didn't help. But he also didn't look the part either. Gains weight, loses his confidence, has nothing. According to his mother, he blew up like a house, eventually gaining 100 pounds, which only added to depression. In 2017, she would drive him to a hospital where he would voluntarily admit himself into a psych ward. He had major issues. He was also doing some odd things like making sexual messages to his mother, just very weird behavior, very odd, but nothing to the level of, violating the law. While weird, not violating the law. Now, something again would happen to DiNardo in and around 2017. He has no real job prospects. He's a psychopath, sends weird messages to women, is making odd comments to his mother, threatening to kill his father, goes to this facility, goes back on his medication, is normal again. The normal behavior would lead to the fact, though, that he still didn't have any friends because he had ostracized all his friends. Nobody wanted to be around him. So while he's on meds, he still has no one to hang out with. Enter Sean Kratz. Now, Sean Kratz is the cousin of Cosmo DiNardo. Cosmo DiNardo's father and Sean Kratz's mother were first cousins. And there was an interesting connection between Kratz and DiNardo. Kratz was the same recluse that DiNardo was. Kratz was a petty criminal. At one point, he was a dishwasher at a retirement home, but he had no job prospects like his cousin. Mr. Kratz was from Northeast Philadelphia, and he had been wanted in many burglaries. He had, petty burglary, robbing homes, stealing lawn furniture, things like that. Nothing crazy. But at one point, he starts graduating to robbing people on the street, gets shot 19 times. Was a low life. That's all Sean Kratz was. This was the last person Cosmo DiNardo should hang out with, because we knew DiNardo was a lunatic, but this Kratz kid was an asshole as well. And together they became this duo that just nobody really should be around and no one should ever hang out with. Nobody wanted to see these people in the street because they didn't think the way everyone else did. Now, for DiNardo's mother and for Kratz's mother, they believed this is great. They're two peas in a pod. They didn't know that they were both lunatics, but they just knew they both were cool and they both liked each other, and this was good for the both of them. They were family. They could hang out together and keep each other busy. The problem was they behind the scenes were drug dealers, and this would change the lives of multiple people in a month or two. So Kratz and DiNardo begin coming up with ideas. And, it's interesting because Sandra DiNardo really had nowhere to go, Cosmo's mother. She had almost, I think, just believed that Sean Kratz was good for him. She would even at one point, according to herself, would go to the Catholic Church. She would turn to a individual called the Father Charles Ravert, her parish priest, to perform a spiritual cleansing of her home to exorcise any demons that might be lurking. She believed that the Roman Catholic faith could help her. She always had a Bible with her. She was desperate for help, and it didn't seem like anyone was willing to help her with it. Now, I want to discuss Mr. DiNardo and some of the psychiatric things that he was dealing with that no one ever did anything. According to psychiatrists, the DiNardos believed he was responsible for everything that would ultimately happen with DiNardo. They would actually file medical malpractice cases against him and the University of Pennsylvania. In a complaint filed by an attorney, Sandra DiNardo would charge that the psychiatrist was well aware of Cosmo DiNardo's complex and dangerous history of psychosis, suicidal, grandiose thoughts, homicidal thoughts, and violent behavior. But despite this knowledge, Dr. Christian Kohler grossly and negligently allowed Cosmo to stop taking his medication, lapse into remission, and do what he ultimately did, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. So when I say he fell through the cracks of the mental health community, he surely did. Why was this individual ever off medication? Why did anyone ever say to him, hey, you shouldn't be on medication anymore? Medication was the only thing that worked for this kid. Now, I want to get into what DiNardo ultimately did, but about a month before this thing happened, he would continue very odd behavior. Mr. DiNardo was seen walking down a street in Bensalem, shooting a 20-gauge shotgun in the air. He admitted to a police officer that he was not illegally allowed to possess firearms because of his prior mental commitment, police records show. Now, we could ask ourselves, why the fuck did no one ever do anything about Cosmo DiNardo? Well, he had a rich father. Rich father bailed him out. He never had to pay for anything. Mr. DiNardo would also, on Snapchat, ran about seeking revenge, appearing bloody in one video after he said he got into a fight at a strip club. In a selfie, the one in which he appeared bare-chested and wild-eyed, aiming a revolver mounted with a laser on the phone. Now, over Independence Day 2017, he sent an ominous video warning in a private Snapchat message to a few dozen friends, according to a person who watched it. He threatened to kill people who owed him money and to get away with it, speaking while lying down with guns arrayed beneath him. I mean, I guess we'll continue to say, why didn't anybody do anything about this? From the mental health professionals, and I say professionals, to the police, to his father. His mother was crying out for help. Nothing was done. Let's go to July 5th, 2017. This is when everything would catch up to Cosmo DiNardo and to the people that never did anything about him. DiNardo would set up, now remember at this point, he is actively selling narcotics. And he would say that he acted as a middleman in what we're about to discuss. And when I say middleman, he allegedly procured an amount of drugs from an unknown individual and was making a deal with a friend of his. The first friend he would invite to his home was Jimmy Taro Patrick. Now, Taro Patrick had a history of, little things, sold a little bit of weed, things like that. But at this point, he had become a sophomore. He was going to Loyola Maryland University in Baltimore, and it seemed like he had got his life back on track. He comes home in 2017 for summer break and sees his old friend Cosmo DiNardo, who he went to high school with. Now, Taro Patrick was 1 year behind Mr. DiNardo. Now, DiNardo would say that Taro Patrick came over to, quote, buy 4 pounds of marijuana at $8,000. Now, everything goes haywire because DiNardo believes that this kid's coming to buy 4 pounds for $8,000. Taro Patrick comes with only $800. And this sends DiNardo into a rage. He believes that the connect that he has is going to kill him for lying, so he does something more sinister. He allegedly tells Taro Patrick that to make this right, he'll sell him a gun and other things to make more money. Taro Patrick gets the gun in his hand, turns away. DiNardo shoots him in the back of the head. Now, DiNardo would eventually and subsequently say, quote, I also burned the money as well. He would dig a hole and throw Taro Patrick into it. He would use, to dig the hole, the same backhoe that he had been taught to use by his father on this big property they had. He would take the body, throw it in a shallow grave. And according to DiNardo, said he would say a prayer and then throw dirt on him. This is the kind of thinking these people have. They believe that God's going to save them for doing this type of shit. This kid believed he was a gangster. He watched way too much Goodfellas, this guy. Now, DiNardo would say in a taped conversation why he burned the $800. He would say, quote, I didn't want the kid's $800. I didn't kill him over the 800. I wasn't robbing him. This was not going to go good for me. The guy would have shot me if I went to him without the 8,000. So what is Cosmo DiNardo doing? He's continuously trying to make excuses for behavior. And he believes he's a gangster. This guy thinks he's John Gotti or Tommy Karate or Carmine Persico. So he's already killed his friend. He shot him in the back of the head, dug a shallow grave, and threw him in it, just like Tony Soprano would do in The Sopranos. This guy believed he was a cartel boss, truly. Now, 2 days later, he would call his cousin, Sean Kratz, and invite him to his property in Upper Solbury Township. Now, Mr. Kratz, as we know, is a serial robber and burglar. Okay, so these kids together are just a big problem. He would summon Dean Finicaro to his home on July 7th. Now, Dean Finicaro, from what I understand, was very close to Mr. DiNardo. At one point, Finicaro would be regarded as a cousin to DiNardo. That's how close they were. Now, according to DiNardo, Dean Finicaro was coming to the farm to buy a quarter pound of weed. But DiNardo had more sinister plans. DiNardo had no weed. In fact, he had a small amount. Not none. He had a small amount. The goal that day was to lure Finicaro on the guise of buying drugs. And Sean Kratz was going to take him out in the middle of the farm on an ATV and rob him. Now, Finicaro, DiNardo believed, had a gun on him. Thus, the reason what would go down went down. They would shoot Finicaro in a barn on the property. Now, according to Cosmo DiNardo, DiNardo would also talk very openly about this murder as well. He would say at one point where they could find the body, DiNardo would say, I'm not lying. He's dead. Go look in the barn. He would also say that his brains are all over the floor of the barn. His head was split the hell open, according to him. So this guy's sitting there telling this stuff in very clear English, like he's telling a bedtime story. I split his fucking head open, and that was that. You can still find the brains on the fucking floor if you want. So that's now 2 victims. Cosmo DiNardo would take Dean Finicaro, put him into a pig roaster, and burn it, the body. Again, thinks he's a gangster, mob guy. A half hour later, he would call 2 more friends that he had. Enter Tom Mayo and Mark Sturgis. Now, Thomas Mayo, according to what I know, had went at one point to East Stroudsburg University, decided that school wasn't for him, so he returned home to work for a construction company that Mark Sturgis's father was a part of. Now, it is important to discuss that Tom Mayo was also someone that sold drugs. Friends of his would say that he sold large amounts of marijuana. I want to make this clear, though. All four of these individuals, no one deserves to die like this under any circumstance, regardless of what they did or may have done. They aren't criminals, okay? They are young kids who, some which didn't have a way in life they were going. But as I said, multiple kids generally just move on with their life, grow up, and that's that. Now, Mayo would go to the home that day that he thought he was going to buy drugs. And I truly believe Mark Sturgis was really just collateral damage. Once getting to the farm, now this is, again, a half hour after Mr. DiNardo kills Dean Finicaro, Mayo and Sturgis come to his home in Mayo's car. They get out of the car, walk towards DiNardo and Kratz. And according to DiNardo, he would say that it seemed like they knew something wasn't right. DiNardo decides very quickly that's going to be that for them as well. They start walking to the farm, Kratz and DiNardo behind them. DiNardo pulls out a gun and shoots Mayo, instantly paralyzing him as he falls down. Sturgis claims, "What the fuck?" And he's shot as well. Mayo ultimately dies, but Sturgis is a big kid, according to DiNardo, that he has to shoot and unload the whole gun on him. Unloads the whole gun on him. Kid's still not dead. DiNardo then gets into the same backhoe that he buried Mr. Taro Patrick in, runs over Sturgis and kills him. Kratz and DiNardo then take both bodies, also put them in a pig roaster, and they burn overnight. Now, according to DiNardo, they would then go to Steve's Prince of Steaks on Bustleton Avenue in Philadelphia and have cheese sticks. But according to him, he couldn't eat it due to the fact of what he had just done. He then would go home, fall asleep, and not think anything of it. And it's weird because you can find a text message exchange between DiNardo and Kratz's mother where they talk about it seemed like the kids had so much fun today. They were quadding and doing all this stuff at the farm. Little did they know that their sons were murderers 4 times over by this point. Now, Cosmo DiNardo would kind of make major mistakes. The problem that he had was he began to act very dumb. He tried to sell Tom Mayo's car for several $100s. He would then not be able to sell it, and he would park it in one of the garages that they had on the property. They also would find, eventually, the police would find that Dean Finicaro's phone would actually ping. It was still on the property. So the cops started to zone in on this property in Upper Solbury Township in Pennsylvania. It was a 90-acre farm, though, very big. Ultimately, the dominoes start to fall for Cosmo DiNardo. On July 12th, Mr. DiNardo would be arrested and charged for stealing and attempting to sell a car that belonged to Tom Mayo. Now, he had already been arrested for unrelated weapons charges. By this point, he would be arrested twice in the matter of 2 days. Cosmo DiNardo had had 30 different run-ins with the police. And I'll ask police again, why was this guy on the street? You'd think eventually he would have to pay for his crimes, but as customary, one thing we learned, if you have money, you can get out of these types of things. Ultimately, though, everything on July 13th would change for Cosmo DiNardo. He would confess that day to what he had done on that family farm. In exchange for his confession, Bucks County prosecutors would state that they would not seek the death penalty against Mr. DiNardo. He would be charged with 4 counts of criminal homicide, conspiracy to commit criminal homicide, abuse of a corpse, and 12 other charges. Several days later, his cousin, Sean Michael Kratz, would also be charged with 3 counts of criminal homicide, conspiracy to commit criminal homicide, abuse of a corpse, and 2 other charges. Now, the problem for Kratz was this was not the first time he had been arrested. Notice on the right, Kratz is in a blue garb. He had already been arrested for burglary at one point. So these 2 were both in custody. And for Cosmo DiNardo, the waterworks would begin in the confession where he talks about running people over with backhoes and all sorts of stuff. At the end, he would, start crying like the little punk that he was. Now, keep in mind, like I said, At the end of the interview, Cosmo DiNardo had just told people that he had buried people in a shallow grave after splitting their head open and their brains are still on the ground. He talks about running people over with backhoes. The waterworks start, according to DiNardo, quote, "I don't know why I did this shit, man," where he begins crying, "My life's done for nothing." He turned into a pumpkin. Remember, this is the same guy that was a big-time drug dealer. He was a mafia boss. He was going to take care of people that betrayed him. He would also say at one point a very odd statement. He would claim that during the interview that at one point he was, quote, going to be whacked by Finicaro, so he whacked him first. It's like he's Joey Massino. They were going to kill me, so I killed them first. This guy was a fucking nut job, lunatic. Had, way too many things going on up here. Should have never been on the street. Ultimately, for Cosmo DiNardo, this wasn't much of a trial. In 2018, DiNardo would plead guilty to 4 counts of murder and was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Now, that same day, Sean Kratz would reject a plea deal of 118 years with the possibility of parole at the 59 years, and his trial would be scheduled for 2019. What Kratz would ultimately do is he tried to pin the blame on his cousin. He would say that the reason he had actually killed Dean Finicaro was because his cousin was threatening to kill him and his brother and his nephew and all sorts of people. And then he was coerced into doing it. He was pressured into doing it. So he rejected a plea deal. Now, a lot of people are probably saying, I would have rejected a plea deal of 118 years too. Remember, though, he was up for parole at the 59 years, which essentially means Crouch probably would have did 25 years and he would be eligible, right? So he had a light at the end of the tunnel, unlike DiNardo. He rejected that plea deal and said, nope, I ain't doing that. I want to go to trial. DiNardo already had his fate sealed. Kratz didn't. He would go to trial. And of course, in 2019 and late 2019, Sean Kratz would be convicted of first and second degree murder in the death of Dean Finicaro, involuntary manslaughter in the deaths of Thomas Mayo and Mark Sturgis. He would later be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Cosmo DiNardo, 4 or 5 years later, sits at the State Correctional Institution at Phoenix. What I find interesting about that location is, if you know anything about SCI Phoenix, it is extremely close to Ben Salem. Even in life in prison status, Mr. DiNardo is still given the ability for his family to go see him. He's not thrown out in the middle of nowhere like his cousin Sean Kratz is. It doesn't matter. To this day, they still give these people the benefit of the doubt. Sean Michael Kratz is 25 years old, and he sits at the State Correctional Institution at Forest. Forest is in Marionville, Pennsylvania, and in the middle of nowhere. So, again, money talks. When you're Cosmo DiNardo, even after committing 4 homicides, they still place you just 20 minutes away from your hometown where your family can come see you. I don't know or understand why Mr. DiNardo did what he did. My thing and thought is, it seemed like he had some major mental problems, but it doesn't negate what he did. He knew exactly what he was doing. That's the reason no one was going to buy insanity or anything like that. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he very eloquently talked about it after the fact. Why did he do it, though? I truly believe Mr. DiNardo believed he was some high-level gangster criminal, and he was going to get away with it. He looked at his life like a gangster looks at their life. The only difference was he did it in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and he wasn't a mafia hitman. That was the difference between the two. What he does today and how he is today, I don't know. We can only hope that he's on medication and he's paying for his crimes. Now, this would not end with the conviction of Cosmo DiNardo. His parents would ultimately be sued in civil court after the families of these people essentially said they're at fault for what they did. They're at fault for allowing what would happen. Now, down the road, I think we could kind of surmise that you can't blame the parents for this kind of thing. However, you know, at the end of the day, like it's on your property, right? All this stuff is going down. I mean, the guns belong to you. Are they at fault for anything? And they would be sued in civil court for wrongful death. At one point, Sandra DiNardo was not fined, though, according to Philly Mag. As she left the courthouse, she would pass 4 rows of seats reserved for the family's victims, the same families that were represented by legal heavyweights. Now, as she passed the mother of Dean Finocchiaro and Mark Sturgis, Sandra DiNardo would start crying and mutter the words, quote, "I'm sorry," to which Dean Finocchiaro's mother said, "Thank you." Jimmy Tara Patrick's grandmother was silent but gave a wink and thumbs up as Sandra rushed out of court in tears. Obviously, what Cosmo DiNardo did affected the 4 families the most. They were young kids. Maybe they made some dumb decisions selling drugs or weed or whatever. But in the end, they probably would have grown up and been just regular kids. We've all made mistakes. The problem was they knew a soulless, demented, and depraved individual named Cosmo DiNardo. And we feel incredibly poor for those families. But I also feel bad for the mother of DiNardo. She had tried hard, but ultimately you're only so much, there's only so much you can do to your kid. She tried to get him into facilities. She tried to help him. She tried to do things for him, but it was ultimately never enough. And in the end, she has to deal with the decisions that her son made, just like any family has to deal with. You look at the families of the Columbine shooters or someone else, even mob families. The families of the people don't do anything, but they have to pay for the crimes that these people commit. It's sad. No one person outside of the families that I feel bad for is his mother. Now, during his time in prison, Cosmo DiNardo has not been exactly a gem of an inmate. According to prison officials, Cosmo became manic and got into a fight with a prison inmate. According to them, it was his roommate. He'd be placed in solitary confinement where he made the mistake of covering the only window he had with a towel. When he didn't respond to commands to take the towel down, a team of correctional officers stormed his cell and a fight ensued. Cosmo wound up in a prison hospital with a broken nose, injured jaw, and another concussion. So it's probable that he's not taking his medication. I haven't heard much about DiNardo since then. I guess I'm always at a crossroads with this show because I would love to tell you the stories of these people. And I truly want people to know about the horror that men and women commit every day in America, whether they're gangsters or whoever. I've often wondered, do people in this show, and as we wrap this show up, I guess I always wonder, do you want to give people like this a platform to speak? And we've seen it on Dateline, we've seen it on 48 Hours and other shows. I've often thought about, writing these people. Do you guys want to hear from them? I guess I'm always at a crossroads as to, do I want to speak to these people? Do I want to get in my car and drive to SCI Phoenix and speak to this person? Is that something I want to give a platform for these people to do? And I think that's always the crossroads of this stuff, because we can talk about what they did, but we would actually believe what he said even if he told us. Obviously, he's a disturbed and demented individual. It's just a very sad story. And I guess I'm always at a crossroads with how deep I want to go into giving these people platforms and ultimately going past what I'm doing now. I've gotten shit for this show. People always say, why do you put these people on pedestals? And that's not my intention with this show. My show is to just talk about history of crime. And I think we're able to do that each week. But this is a really sad story. And it's a sad story on many levels. We can, again, comment on, maybe some of the things these young men did as young 20 somethings, but most of them probably would have grown up and just became regular people. I can't say I was the most behaved kid at 19, 20 years old. Even some of these are mugshots, but they ultimately would have just became regular people probably. The only connection they had was meeting this monster. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope you learned something today. A very sad and depraved case. And may all of the four individuals, Jimmy Tara Patrick, Dean Fittecaro, Tom Mayo, and Mark Sturgis, may they all rest in peace. They died way too early. And I'm glad Cosmo DiNardo is paying for his crimes, as well as his cousin, Sean Kratz. They are dangerous individuals that don't belong breathing the same air as we do. As always, I hope you enjoyed the show. If you can enjoy this type of content, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Next week is another very interesting episode of the show. I will say by the end of January, I have a couple of big interviews coming out where we're going to sit down in person with some pretty interesting people. So that's something to look forward to. I continue to hope to grow the show. I know in June, I'm going to attempt to go out to Moscow, Idaho, and cover the Idaho 4 case. I don't know if I'll get into the courtroom. In fact, I don't think I will, but I think it'll be interesting to be on the ground nonetheless. So make sure you subscribe, make sure you show love so you continue to get all the content that we're putting out here on the Sit Down. I appreciate you watching. We'll see you next week here on the show.